couple years ago, as we built the facility I'm standing in right now, I learned a whole lot about structural integrity. Now, the definition of structural integrity is the ability of a structure to withstand its intended load without failing due to fracture or fatigue. So building structural integrity can be compromised by, a natural disaster, or a defective material or faulty design. But the thing that's interesting is the damage is never isolated to the beam or to the column that's fractured or fatigued, is it? The load and the stress get transferred to all the other parts of the structure surrounding it. The failure of one part often leads to the collapse of the whole structure. Now, what in the world does that have to do with your life? Well, I want to show you in just a second. Welcome to Journey at Home, where we want to inspire you to follow Jesus and live a better life. If you are new with us, thank you so much for watching. Just hit that subscribe button and the bell for notifications because I don't want you to miss any of this new content we're releasing today in our brand new series, The Perfect Guide for Life, How Integrity Brings Clarity and Courage. So integrity is a subject that impacts every single aspect of your life and mine. See, just like with structural integrity, when you have a failure of personal integrity, or when I have a failure of personal integrity, the damage is never isolated to one area of our life or even just our individual life. This is really easy to overlook, especially when we feel like it's going to cost us something if we maintain our integrity. But a lack of integrity creates damage in the lives of those we love and everybody that we care about most. Now, you have seen this when a family member has a lack of integrity and the stress gets transferred to the entire family, or a child's lack of integrity can create marriage stress, can it? Companies have imploded. Thousands of people have lost their jobs because of the lack of integrity by a CEO or a member of the board. The load's always transferred and the consequences are never isolated. Every failure of integrity adds stress to the lives of the people around you because your irresponsibility becomes their responsibility. Now, in the next episode, I'm going to give you a definition of integrity, but first, we need to answer a question. Where do you anchor your integrity? And the reason this is such a big question is because we all look for loopholes, don't we? I mean, it's easy to excuse decisions that at one point in our lives we said we would never make. It's easy to justify directions that we said we'd never take. But here's what I know about you. You may look for a way to excuse away your lack of integrity, but you're like me, you always expect integrity from the people around you. You expect it from your family, from your preachers and teachers, your leaders, your boss, your coworkers, your employees. Students who cheat on tests, they expect their teachers to grade fairly, don't they? Unfaithful spouses expect their spouses to be faithful. Employees who waste time at work expect to be paid for their full hours anyway. Integrity is a universal expectation which points to something significant. Integrity assumes there is an ought to that we readily appeal to and everyone around us is accountable to. Now let me slow down and say that one more time. Our expectation of integrity from the people all around us indicates that we believe there's an ought to. In other words, there's a standard of integrity that all people should follow. We assume there's an ought to that we can readily appeal to when someone doesn't practice integrity, and we can hold all the people around us accountable to. See, you probably had a moment in your life when you looked at somebody and you said, "You lied to me." But I bet before that moment, the two of you had never had a conversation where you came to an agreement that it was actually wrong to lie. Nope, without any of those conversations, you still felt confident to look at them and declare, "You lied to me," because you assume everybody knows lying is wrong and everybody should be held accountable for not telling the truth. That is what I mean by an ought to. That's a standard. That's just universally expected. And you know it's universally accepted because nobody ever responds to "you lied to me" by saying, "What's the big deal? Lying's not wrong." No, all of us make excuses for our lying. Our actions and our reactions, though, think about it, they prove we believe there really is an objective standard. There's something universally true for all people. There's this ought to, this standard that we should all follow. If we didn't believe that, we wouldn't feel the need to make excuses for our lack of integrity. So, why can't somebody just decide lying's not wrong, at least not for me? Why can't somebody treat their integrity as more suggestion than rule, as more fluid than fixed? Why can't you just use integrity as a tool to get your way until it gets in the way, and then you just throw it away and do as you please? Well, because we all intuitively know that integrity is anchored to something that is immovable and unchangeable. So 2,000 years ago, Paul, the apostle, he was writing about this to the Christians in the city of Rome. Now, this wasn't exactly the epicenter of integrity, if you know much about the Roman Empire, but he reminded them, regardless of the behavior of all the people around them, that no one can escape the ought to that we all appeal to and the ought to that we all hold others accountable to. In Romans 2, as he's writing this letter to them, he writes, indeed, when Gentiles, or non-Jewish people, who do not have the law, so the law Paul's referring to is the objective standard or the ought to that his Jewish people, because he was Jewish, that his Jewish people had received from God through Moses centuries before. So you've heard the Ten Commandments, right? Well, that's part of this law. And Paul's going, God spelled out the ought tos for us Jewish people. But most of the non-Jewish people there in Rome, well, they've never read our scriptures. They've never read our law. They don't know it. But when those people, Paul says, who have never read it, do by nature things required by that law, well, then they're a law for themselves, even though they don't have the law. In other words, Paul's going, when you see them intuitively know their ought tos, their universal right and wrongs that are a part of our law, well, they're proving the existence of an objective law that they might verbally reject, but they behaviorally support. And then he says, they show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, their thoughts sometimes accusing them, other times, Paul says, even defending them. In other words, Paul's point is, all you have to do to watch the expectations people have of one another, just pay attention to what they expect of one another. Integrity is a universal expectation which proves the existence of this objective standard that God created. Now, how else do you explain all people in all places and all times, they largely have the same expectations, don't they? Well, God wrote it on their hearts. He put it in their nature at birth. And when they violate their integrity, when they violate that standard, their thoughts accuse them of doing wrong. And when they do the right thing, even when it costs them, well, their thoughts defend them, choosing the road of integrity. So if you value integrity, if you want the people around you to live with integrity, if you want the ability to hold people around you accountable to integrity, you have to start by acknowledging this, that there's an ought to that stands over you that didn't originate with you. It didn't originate with me either, and we can't escape it. Integrity is anchored to God. It's anchored to His objective standard for our lives. You remove that, you don't have integrity anymore. All you have then is a tool you use to get your way until it gets in your way. So, you can deny the existence of a universal objective standard if you want. You can act as if that doesn't exist. Everybody gets to have their own truth. Everybody gets to decide what's right and wrong for themselves. But I promise you, your reactions tell a different story. Your reactions prove that you're certain a standard exists because you appeal to it every time someone wrongs you. If you didn't believe it existed, you'd never react as if you'd been wronged, because no such thing as wronged could even exist. You'd just assume that every man and every woman gets to do what's right in their own eyes. But the reality is you know better, and so do I. Now, if you find yourself resisting this idea of an objective standard that comes from God and it doesn't come from you, well, let me just give you one little thing to think about. Allowing personal or public opinion to choose your standard, that's both illogical and dangerous, and this is really easy to prove. Do you believe women should be allowed to vote? I bet you do, but based on what? I believe they should be because I don't want to be locked out of the house tonight. But how else do we know it's the right thing to do? Well, as you know, there was a time in this country when the majority opinion was that women shouldn't be allowed to vote. Was it right because the majority agreed on that as a standard? Because it was the prevailing personal opinion at the time? Hey, what about slavery? I mean, there was a time when the prevailing opinion was that some people were born to rule and others to be ruled. Now, we certainly don't believe that's true. But my question is, how do you prove it? What if, just imagine, what if the majority of our world swung back to believing slavery was moral and just? Are you going to swing with them? Well, of course you're not, but why not? See, your outrage at the thought reveals you believe there's an objective moral standard that defines slavery and defines the subjugation of women as morally wrong for all people, all places, all throughout history. Without an objective standard outside of you that stands over you and didn't originate with you, well, you couldn't declare anything as wrong for all people. Integrity, for it to actually exist, it must be anchored to the objective standard that is the law of God over you. And I know it puts pressure on you and me to meet it. But you don't want to live in a world where it's defined by public opinion or personal preferences. So whether you have chosen to follow God or not, when you do what's right, even when it costs you, you are acknowledging the rule of God over you. You're acknowledging there's a standard above you, whether you want to admit it or not. And when you insist other people treat others honestly, justly, and with dignity, you're acknowledging the kingdom of God as well. So, my question is, will you choose to accept God's objective standard over you instead of appealing to it and at the same time personally dismissing it? Will you surrender to God's ought to for your life because it's the ought to that will best serve you? If you're thinking, Matt, my problem is I've already lost my integrity, and you're thinking that because you got a decision or series of decisions that have violated your integrity, listen, I get those feelings. It feels like you can never regain it. It feels like you just can't recover from your lack of integrity. But I have good news. You can. And over the next few episodes, I'm going to show you how to get your integrity back if you've lost it. And for all of us, I'm going to show us how to guard it and how to model it so you never lose it or you never lose it again. But the starting point is surrendering to God's ought to that really is best for you. You got to be willing to anchor your integrity to Him, or you'll have nothing objective to ever anchor it to. So will you acknowledge there's an ought to that stands over you and didn't originate with you? And will you choose to hold yourself accountable to His standard? You won't regret it.